Welcome, everyone, to our University of Missouri Extension Leasing Series, designed to help farmers and property owners with leasing arrangements. I'm Julie Harker, news strategist with Kapner Extension. To kick off our weekly series, Dr. Ray Massey, Extension business and policy expert, is with us to talk specifically about landlords and tenants and the types of leases that exist. Just a quick note, we will have time for questions at the end of each of our programs. For Q&A, please feel free to type your questions in at any point into the chat, and we will be able to answer those at the end. Ray, do tell us a little bit more about your background and why you thought it was important to develop this series.
So I'm an ag economist at the University of Missouri with the Ag Business and Policy group, and I work with farmers, ranchers, business persons, government personnel about farm management issues. And one of the most common questions that I get is leasing. They're always wanting to know what should occur in a lease, what prices should be used. And so I decided, there's a whole lot more about leasing than just some of the questions I get. There's what I call the who, what, when, where, why, and how questions. So I wanted to address those. And we'll be looking at land leases, livestock leases, energy and recreational leases, just a host of different types. And what we want to do over the next 10 weeks, though, is share some of the experiences that me and other extension educators have had as we address farm questions that farmers are asking. So we're going to discuss economic principles and how they apply. We're going to look at good business practices and how that would impact it. And we'll also be looking at some of the business and policy and legal issues that occur in this. We won't be giving legal advice, but we'll note where you need to talk to an attorney on things of that nature.
And you will have resources available too.
Yes, at the end of every session, we'll be mentioning resources that they could go to get guides or other forms to help them out.
All right. So who should be interested in learning more about leasing?
Well, the two people that are involved in a lease are the landowner and the tenant. So those are the two that we're really addressing during most of this. I get most of my questions from landowners, but if I could do anything, I'd say get the two together and get them talking so that they'd understand what each one is thinking. So why don't we just, at this point, take a few minutes to look at this video on the landowner and tenant relationship in leasing.
This video gives information on the differences between landlords and tenants. It was created by the University of Missouri Agricultural Business and Policy Extension Program as part of a series to help landowners and farmers better use agricultural leases. Agricultural leasing often evokes the image of a younger farmer using the land or the equipment of an older retired farmer. This simplistic view of using the land can obscure what each person offers and seeks in agricultural leasing. Understanding the experiences and the goals of both tenant and landlord gives insight into the ways to create and manage effective leases. Farmers, or prospective farmers, seek to control assets so that they can produce their business's products and services. Those who rent property from landowners are frequently called tenants. Legal documents might refer to tenants as lessees. Tenants seek land, equipment, buildings, even animals to use and further their farming enterprise. Farmers seek assets to rent for several reasons. Owning might be the farmer's long-term objective, but often renting is the best option available for starting, expanding, and maintaining a farming enterprise. One common reason for renting is that desired assets often are not for sale. The only way to control the productive asset is to rent it. If the desired property is for sale, the purchase price may exceed the farmer's financial resources. The farmer may not have sufficient cash for the purchase and may be unable to borrow sufficient cash, or simply has other demands for the cash on hand. On the other side of the lease from the farming tenant is the landlord or the landowner. Legal documents will refer to them as lessors. They are individuals who, for various reasons, have property that they are not using and therefore can lease it to others. Different landlords bring different experiences, strengths, goals, and dreams to the leasing situation. A large portion of landlords have previously farmed the land but are not actively farming it now. They may be retired or have, for some other reason, decided to no longer farm a particular piece of land. These landlords know both the farm and the business of farming. They have planted, tended, and harvested on the land they are leasing out. They have a history with it. They also understand farming in general and will have ideas and experiences of value to the tenant. They may even be interested in helping the tenant during some of the busy times. Non-operating landlords have more than just the property to offer to tenants. Another large portion of landlords are the children or spouse of the former active farmer. Children and spouses may have had non-farming careers for many years. These landowners know their farms well, but may be less aware of the business of farming. They have memories of the great harvest 20 years ago and haying in the summer. They are aware that the backside of the farm has flooding problems and when the terraces were installed to control erosion. These landlords likely have an emotional interest in the land that comes from having lived with it for years. But they may be less likely to participate in farming decisions the tenant is making. They want to maintain a relationship with the farm, and they seek a tenant who will care for the farm and communicate regularly with them. Some landowners own land with which they are only mildly familiar and may have little understanding of agriculture as a business. Some have inherited the land. Others may have purchased land purely as an investment to lease out. These landlords are more difficult to define because their objectives range from the very emotional, as a child I spent every Thanksgiving on this farm, to purely financial, this is where I have invested $500,000. It is important for the tenant to get to know the objectives of these landowners so that she can take them into consideration as she farms the land. Over time, property ownership changes from one person to another. The tenant may find a different owner brings significant changes to renting the same property. Location may influence the prevalence of each category of landowners. Over 50% of Iowa landowners have farmed the land. Arkansas has the largest percentage of landlords who have never farmed. A tenant renting several different fields may have leases with different types of landlords. The differences in the individual contracts may be due, in large part, to the differences between the landlords. Both tenants and landlords benefit from understanding what the other party is bringing to the table. Each brings different experiences and goals. The landlord-tenant relationship is one that contributes to the success of leasing agreements. That relationship benefits from communication and transparency.
So that's very interesting to hear the differentiation about the different types of tenants and landlords. I wanted to ask you, maybe drill down a little bit, among the three types of owners, those who previously farmed their land, are they always retired?
No. So I'm in the middle of a research project right now, which we're looking at landowners and how they make decisions. And you can kind of draw some parallels. Usually some of the older farmers that have farmed their land that are leasing it, middle-aged farmers may have inherited it or something of that nature. And young landowners may have also inherited it. Mm-hmm. So there's some similarities, but not all the time. Mm-hmm. And so some of the things that we're looking at in farmers that have recently farmed their farm is they are looking at more than just the finances surrounding it. They are saying, hey, can I help out a young farmer? So can I continue to be involved in the farms? How can I help out my neighborhood, my town, and things of that nature? They're also looking at the long-term benefit of their land, which is somewhat counterintuitive because you think, okay, here's a retired farmer, let's say he's 70 years old. And you go, well, are you looking for the long-term benefit? Why? So when I'm talking to farmers in a meeting, I'll actually ask them, how many of you have planted a tree in the last 2 or 3 years? And it's amazing how many older farmers say, yes, I planted a tree in the last couple of years. And I kind of maybe get a little flippant and I just ask them, you're not going to get to enjoy it. Why did you plant it? And they all smile and say, we're concerned about the long-term aspects of our land, even though we are retired. So there's something emotional. There's something there that people that have farmed the land are really not quite as simple as I'm just looking for income.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what about those landowners who have not recently farmed the land?
They're actually a little bit more difficult to understand. I mean, once you talk with them, you can begin to understand them, but they're more varied. So I have interacted with some farmers that have not farmed the land who are actually quite anxious. They say, am I getting ripped off? Am I getting enough? Is my tenant taking advantage of me? And on the exact opposite side, I have tenants that say, man, my land, I have landowners that are saying, my tenant is doing such a good job. I really appreciate the work that he's doing. So there's both this, I'm not sure. And then there's this, I love the guy. And so they do have kind of different set of questions. But one of the things that I find about investors is even investors have a different way of looking at the land. So again, frequently we'll think, well, the investor's wanting to know just about how much money they can make this year. They frequently are interested in the long-term health and value of that land. And so they're doing some decisions that might be counterintuitive just to maintain the value of their land. They're very involved in conservation, for example. So what I'm learning from this research project that I'm on is that you actually have to talk with the landowner to know the landowner. It's not, again, you can make some ideas, you know, just, you will know him just by his age or his experience. They're different.
Well, you've done a good job of explaining a little more in depth about landowners and tenants, but we haven't really got a definition for what is a lease. So what is a lease?
So a lease is actually just an agreement between a property owner and a property user. So the property owner has some type of property that they're willing to let somebody else use for a certain period of time in exchange for some benefit. So it might be they're taking care of the property or they are paying a rent on the property. So it's just a property owner giving the right to a farmer, usually in this case, to use the land for a certain period of time for a certain reason. And that's also pretty important. And he can do that with land, buildings, grain bins, equipment, livestock, even recreational activities. So you can lease any aspect of property that you might have.
That's great. Well, we're going to find out more about the different types of leases in our next video, but I did want to remind everyone that you can still ask questions in the chat box, and we'll get to those at the end. So now our video.
Almost anything used in agriculture can be leased. Most people think of land leases where a landowner gives the right to plant and harvest crops to a farmer. In addition, equipment used in crop and livestock production is leased. Buildings used to store grain or shelter equipment and animals can be leased. Breeding livestock are leased. Even permission to enjoy the land by hunting and fishing is granted through lease agreements. Tenants want access to land, equipment, buildings, and animals. The way the tenant compensates the landowner reveals much about each person's situation and needs. About 70% of leases are fixed cash rent, with the remaining 30% using some other type. Fixed cash rent is when the tenant pays a fixed amount of cash to the property owner for the right to use the property. The property owner likes fixed cash leases because she knows what the income will be. A fixed cash rent means the property owner does not have to be concerned about the management details of her property. Many tenants also prefer fixed cash rents, especially if they each have several landlords. With a fixed cash rent, the tenant can make most management decisions without consulting with the property owners. Record keeping is simpler because the cash rent payment is considered an expense for financial analysis and tax purposes. One challenge for fixed cash rent might be the timing of the payments to the property owner. Many landowners prefer to receive the entire cash rent before the crop is harvested. This can put a financial strain on the tenant. A fixed cash lease can be risky for the tenant. In a year with poor yields or poor prices, the cash rent expense can be the difference between profit and loss. This causes some tenants to seek other lease types. Flexible cash rent is an attempt to share the risks and benefits between property owner and tenant. When yields and prices rise, the rent increases. When yields and prices fall, the tenant pays less rent. Much thought needs to go into developing the flexible rent base and how changes in rent would result from yield and price fluctuations. The crop share lease also attempts to share risks and rewards between the property owner and the tenant. In a crop share lease, the property owner will get a share of the crop produced and must market that crop to get cash. Also, the property owner usually pays a portion of the inputs, such as seed and fertilizer. Sharing of input costs benefits a tenant who does not have a strong financial position to borrow money for production. The most common livestock lease is a share lease. The livestock owner provides the livestock and may share in some production costs. The tenant provides labor, management, and pays many of the other production costs, such as feed and veterinary care. Both livestock owner and tenant split the income according to their contribution. Different types of property owners might understandably choose different types of leases. A landowner who knows the farm and knows farming may choose a crop share lease to continue some involvement in the farm. A landowner who knows little about the farm and farming may want a cash rent for investment and tax reasons. Different tenants will also choose different types of leases. A beginning farmer may need or want the managerial and financial assistance provided by the landowner in a crop share lease. A tenant with many landlords and sufficient resources may want a cash lease that gives him maximum management flexibility. Whether land or livestock or equipment is leased, there are multiple ways the property owner can be compensated. There are potentially dozens of lease permutations. That is why it is so important to have written leases. This video by the University of Missouri Agriculture Business and Policy Extension Program introduced cash, flexible, and share leases. Each type of lease will be covered in more detail in other videos. You can also go to aglease101.org for several publications on these different types of leases.
These videos are great, Ray. They answer a lot of questions. But if you have any that come up and you'd like to share with the group, you can put them in the bottom box, the chat box, and it'll pop right up and you can type it in and we'll take a look at it at the end. Ray, I did want to ask you, can any property be leased? And what are the most common leases?
Yes, any property can be leased.
Okay.
And the most common lease is a land lease. So 30% of the Missouri agricultural land or privately held land is leased already. And when I say anything can be leased, it actually becomes somewhat of a challenge to know what is happening. So, for example, if I lease to you my farm, which also has a barn on it, am I leasing to you the barn? And that's part of the challenge that goes along with getting a good lease is to communicate to the tenant and the landowner what is exactly in the lease. But you can lease livestock, equipment, grain bins, anything, but land is the most common. And so we'll be spending about 5 groups on that and then looking at some other things.
Yeah. So the video did mention fixed cash leases, flex cash leases, and share leases. Why is the fixed cash lease the most common type?
Well, it's the easiest.
Okay.
So let me back up a little bit and go with share leases. Share leases were much more common 30 years ago, and they began to switch to cash leases within the last 30 years, essentially quite heavily. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason is they are just easier. So if I'm a tenant and I have 5 landlords, it's much easier to communicate with him just once a year over payment than if I have to talk with him about sharing the expenses that would come with a share lease. So communication is easier. Multiple landowners is easier. Tax implications are simpler. It's considered a passive investment or passive income for the most part, not always. And government programs are simpler. So it is just simpler. Now, having said that, a lot of the conversation that I have with landowners is over the negative side of the cash lease, and that's that sharing of risk.
Mm-hmm.
And so some landowners, when they see prices of income go up real high, they're saying, man, my tenant's making a lot of money this year, but my rent is fixed. Or maybe they see just a magnificent yield and they still say, oh, my tenant just made tons of money this year, but I'm stuck. And so they start to want to raise their rent. On the flip side is that the landowner will raise the rent and then the price goes down and the tenant saying, I wish that my landowner would bring the price down. So cash rent is easy, but it does have some issues that we need to discuss perhaps throughout this series.
All right, very good. Well, I have some questions for you until we get some in the chat. I think we do have one that we'll start with. What is required for a landowner to terminate a lease with a tenant? Is there a difference when there's a verbal versus a written lease?
There is. In a written lease, you can write in there the beginning date and the end date. And when the end date comes, the lease is ready to be terminated. So there is some uncertainties on what happens if you just continue to let it go forward. But that is the end date, even if you let it go forward. With a written lease, it's much more complicated. That's one reason with a verbal lease, it's much more complicated. That's why we encourage written leases. But with a verbal lease, there's a state law that goes into effect. And essentially, on the date that you established the lease for the first time, like let's say March 1st,
Mm-hmm.
you have to give 60 days notice, which would be January 1st, of that you want to terminate the lease. The problem is, do the landowner and tenant remember when the date was that they established the lease? And so it's a little bit more difficult, but there are rules. Written lease when it's written, or oral lease or the state law.
So the videos show that people in a lease agreement and the different types of leases, do some of those leases suit some people better than others?
Definitely. Like we mentioned a little earlier, a landowner who knows the farm and knows farming will be very comfortable with a share lease. At least he's more comfortable. There may be some other financial reasons he might not want to do it. A young tenant may benefit from the lower input costs that come along with a share lease.
Okay.
So there's different people have different objectives, different resources, different constraints, and you can probably work to get a lease that helps meet those. If you just think through, it's not just a cash or just this. We can work for it. There's another question.
Oh, we do have another question. Do leases typically run year by year or for larger chunks of time?
So about 75% of leases, land leases, I should say, are annual. They're renewed annually. But when you look at the statistics, over half of those have lasted for more than 7 years. So they're renewed annually, but they last, or over half last for more than 7 years. Some of them have lasted 20 or 30 years, but they're renewed annually. So it does beg the question of how long should a lease be? A tenant would prefer a longer lease usually. A landowner is maybe a little hesitant to give longer leases. That's just a point of negotiation that can be done as we're thinking through how to form the lease. To make it annual or make it renew every 3 years or 5 years. You can do whatever you want.
Right.
But if you are doing a verbal lease, it is assumed annual.
All right. Good question. The types of leases center on the way property owners are compensated for the leased property. So is compensation the most important?
Compensation is usually what people are most interested in. And it is important. There's no doubt about it. But a lot of the questions I get, the problems that have occurring with a lease are not around compensation. They're around activities that the tenant's doing or that the landowner wants done and things of that nature. So we can't get away from, yes, I want a rental payment. I have an investment that I have here. But if we're wanting to get away from some of the problems, we'll discuss other issues such as why exactly is this land being leased, or this equipment, or this livestock. So there's more than just money.
Okay, good to know. We do have another question that came in. Can rent to own be something available for a new fund?
Yes, it can. And actually, that's a fun story. Can't tell all the names, but in this research that we've been doing about landowners and how they make decisions, we ran across a landowner who said that let's just say he's got 1,000 acres for simplicity. He says, I have 1,000 acres that I rent to a young farmer, but I sold him 100 acres in which I am financing that 100 acres. And when he gets enough collateral in that, enough money put away in that, I'll sell him another 100 acres, and I'll just be moving him slowly into ownership. You don't have to be slow about it. I mean, that was that one experience I had with the landowner. But you could actually write a contract, and I would encourage you seriously to get both your accountant and your attorney involved in any type of contract like that, because there's a lot of implications of transferring land via a lease, but with ownership in the end product.
Excellent. Thank you for all this great information, and thanks to those who asked questions. How can folks get a hold of you if they do have questions outside of this?
So the best way to get a hold of me is using my email, and that's massey@missouri.edu, and David is typing it in the text box for you right now, so you'll be able to see it here in a few minutes. And if you are not comfortable using an email of massey@missouri.edu, you're welcome to call me at 573-884-7788.
Very good. Now, this program has been recorded. Where will this be available, and how will they access it? What information do we need?
So our intent is tomorrow to send out an email to all of the participants that have registered for this course. And with that, they will get the link to where this program is recorded. And it'll also have linked to some material. Like this morning, I sent out to most registrants an extension guide. We have extension guides that are very useful. And there will be a link to that extension guide if you didn't get my email from this morning.
Okay. Thank you so much for all this great information. And thanks to all of you for joining us. I'll be back next week with another specialist, Amy Brashears, and she's going to be talking about the transfer of rights and lease negotiations. Until then, thank you and have a good evening.